Hi, my name is Minette Church, and I'm the faculty director here at the UCCS Heller Center for the Arts and Humanities. Tonight, we, along with the English department, are proud to welcome our Spring 2021 Heller Center Fellow, Christine Stewart-Nuñez, South Dakota's Poet Laureate and Professor of English at South Dakota State University. This fellowship, now completing its third year, advances intellectual and creative conversations. Co-sponsored with one or more of the Heller-affiliated academic departments, the Heller Center invites preeminent scholars and artists to UCCS to connect with students, faculty, and the public through lectures, performances, classes, workshops, and field studies. For those of you for whom this is your first Heller program, I would like to give a little bit of background about before the introduction of tonight's speaker. The Heller Center has been part of the UCCS campus since 1999. It's a 34-acre property, and it was once the home of Larry and Dorothy Heller, who built it. They're a couple who lived in Colorado Springs through the mid-20th century. Larry was a well-known local regional artist. Dorothy was one of the first women to work for the Colorado Springs Police Department as a social investigator, which actually meant she was really a detective, but they didn't allow women to be detectives at that time. So Dorothy was one of the first women. When she died in 1999, she donated her home and extensive property, sizable art collection, and a wealth of historic artifacts to the university to foster interdisciplinary collaboration between the arts, humanities, and social sciences among students, faculty, staff, and local area residents. We here at the Heller Center want to thank Event Services for working with us to stream tonight's program. Tonight is our final program for Spring 2021 semester. Keep watch on our website and Facebook pages for the upcoming summer program series. Please go to heller.uccs.edu for more information. Introducing tonight's speaker is Senior Instructor of English, Catherine Grandorf. Professor Grandorf has been at UCCS since 2013 in the Rhetoric and Creative Writing program. She completed her undergraduate and graduate work at South Dakota State University. Her research focuses on the intersections of language, gender, and place. Her work has appeared in such journals as Prairie Schooner and Influence, Action, and Voice, Contemporary South Dakota Women. She is the founder of Colorado Springs Feminists, a local group providing opportunities to women and girls in our area and beyond. Professor Grandorf.
Thank you so much, Minette. And hello, everyone. Thank you for being with us tonight. It is my honor to introduce tonight's speaker. The prairies of the American Midwest provide much to our country: corn, soybeans, wheat. In this region's soil nurtures our nation, and tonight's speaker brings that rich spirit with her as she broadcasts this lecture tonight from the Heller Center here at UCCS, which overlooks the Front Range. Dr. Christine Stewart-Nuñez currently serves as South Dakota's Poet Laureate and has authored 7 books of poetry. Her poetry, as well as her essays, have garnered numerous literary awards over the years. Like the farmers who diligently rotate their crops, she has planted seeds, cultivating aspects of her identities as professor, creative writer, and active community member. Among her contributions, she has co-edited 2 books, both featuring both literary and scholarly submissions, founded the Women Poets Collective, and released the poetry anthology she edited, South Dakota in Poems. She served on the board of directors for the South Dakota State Poetry Society from 2012 to 2018, and edited its poetry magazine, Pask Petals, from 2014 to 2018. Fruits of these labors have resulted in an abundance of accolades, such as being named South Dakota Council of Teachers of English Author of the Year, a 2020 Woman of Distinction, an Outstanding Experiential Learning Educator in 2019, and the F.O. Butler Award in 2017. Tonight we have the great honor to share in the harvest of her work. Please help me welcome Dr. Christine Stewart-Nuñez, Poet Laureate of South Dakota.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for that amazing introduction. Before I begin my presentation tonight, I just want to express some gratitude. First, I'd like to acknowledge that I am a perpetual visitor at home in South Dakota, as well as land I stand on here in South understand there are also many others, maybe 45, 48 others. I'd like to also thank the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, and the Heller Center, especially Rhonda Goodman-Gagan and Catherine Grandorf for this amazing experience. You have an incredible resource here, and I'm very jealous that I don't get to experience it all the time, just this 1 week. So maybe I'll have to creep back on. So thank you so much. So I have a presentation here tonight for you that involves a little bit of scholarly background and ekphrasis, and then as well as a reading of some of my poetry that is inspired by art. So my presentation tonight is intersections of poetry and art. So the image you're seeing is my two latest books that are On Trust and Blue Woods Greening, and both of them were inspired by a fellowship I had at the South Dakota Art Museum, where I worked with a collection there, especially the women of the permanent collection and some of the South Dakota female artists that were in an exhibit while I was the fellow at that time. And there are a lot of other subjects besides art in these books, but tonight I'll focus a little bit on the art that inspired the poems, as well as a little bit of the background of the form of the poems and what inspired them from my experiences too. So you can turn the slide now.
We're checking on the sound.
Oh, sound, okay. Are we good? Okay. So ekphrasis is a Greek word. It means to bring forth, to speak forth. I imagine that rhetors in Greece who wrote long oratories would use a lot of description for their audiences to bring into the mind's eye images that they were speaking about. Over the centuries, it has been used by poets and creative writers of all sorts to bring vivid images into their audience's eyes, and now we typically refer to it as a verbal translation of a visual composition. There are many, many historical examples. I'm just showing you a few of them on the slide. It seems like for many hundreds of years, when writers would use ekphrasis or use art for inspiration, they would mostly focus on canonical pieces of art that a lot of people knew about. And in these ways, they would create conversations about art pieces in their creative works. This is an example of Peter Bruegel's Fall of Icarus. You can see Icarus's feet in the corner there. And then on the next slide, we'll see there are three different poets that have responded to this, Auden, William Carlos Williams, and Michael Hamburger. I was joking that I kind of stumbled upon Michael Hamburger's lines on Bruegel. I'm not sure when he wrote that. I stumbled upon it online and I couldn't track down the source for that. But this is just to show that painting has been responded to by many different poets from different generations over in the 20th century. This is one of my favorite examples of the conversations. So Picasso's The Old Guitar inspired Wallace Stevens to write a poem, and then that poem inspired, and that conversation inspired the next slide, which is artist David Hockney's response in the 1970s. And he did a whole series of art pieces based on Wallace Stevens' poem, which was a response to Picasso's painting. So I'm really fascinated by these conversations among the arts and the sisterhood of arts, poets and writers and artists speaking to each other across time and even just across countries and across places today. So there's been a lot of scholarship on ekphrasis from critics, especially looking at different milieus of ekphrasis. Claire Barbetti talks about it in the medieval period, about what ekphrasis as a contemplative act, a complex process of perception, memory, translation, interpretation, and composition. She really gets down and shows like how it's a process, even then as it is today. Barbara K. Fisher, she also writes as B.K. Fisher as a poet. She breaks it down even more and talks about all the intellectual processes involved in an ekphrastic response. And one of the things that I appreciated as a writer is I started responding to art long before I learned what the critics had to say about it. I was invited in graduate school to participate in a project with an artist at the Sheldon Art Gallery in Nebraska. And I was fascinated, and I was really nervous, first of all, because I didn't know very much about art, and I thought I had to know a lot about art in order to respond to it. But what I learned in that first poem experience was that I can just look and take in those impressions, and that impression could lead to art. And I think that's what kind of cracked open this idea for me, that I could find a lot of ways to grow as a writer by looking at art as inspiration. So then, after I started practicing ekphrasis for many, many years, and then I took a break, and I actually looked at the scholarship around it, I found that I had been doing many of these things that the critics talk about in my own poems. This is just an example of, this is a timeline of my ekphrastic work. The art gallery is on there, and then I wrote a chapbook of poems based on a 40-page portfolio of artists responding to Kate Moss in W Fashion magazine. I gave a presentation about it, and then I had the fellowship at the South Dakota Art Museum, which led to the exhibition in 2016. These two books, like I mentioned earlier, have a lot of those poems in them, but I'm still continuing that process by my new book coming out, The Poet and the Architect, which is based on more architecture ekphrasis. My husband is a professor of architecture at South Dakota State, and I've learned a lot about architecture as a way of and responding to architecture as art as well. So that's just a little brief timeline of my kind of experience working with art. So let me begin the reading portion of my presentation, and I'd be really happy to answer more questions about ekphrasis. So if you put them in the chat after the reading, I will be happy to answer them as best I can. I know that this is kind of, some people know a lot about responding to art with writing, and some people don't know anything about it. So please put your questions in there, and I'll try to answer them as best I can. This first poem is called Sheer, and that image you just saw up there was a piece by Madeline Ritz. And when I was first looking at this watercolor, I noticed a lot of the qualities about the sheerness of the paint and how you could see through it through layers. And one of the things I did when I was looking at the art is I tried to, sometimes I would just describe, like the traditional ekphrasis, I would describe the art and I would look at what I was seeing, I would describe what I was seeing in it. But oftentimes I would burst out of that description and I would start to do a variety of things. I would start to meditate on what I saw in there. I would start to give stories to the people and places that I saw in the art. I would associate or riff off of that. And oftentimes, as you'll see in these, as you'll hear soon, I would look at the art as a lens for my own experiences, and I would be able to get to more emotional topics that I wanted to express with the help of the art as a lens or as a framework. So sheer communication is a ghazal. It's a form of poetry, and you'll notice that there is some rhyme in it, and there is also a refrain at the end of the second line. One of the things about a ghazal that's often not understood by just a reader new to it is that the couplets are supposed to be independent of each other. So they're brought together in the poem as thematically, but they're not supposed to tell a story necessarily or narrate something that's linear. So as you listen to the poem, kind of think about the sheer quality of the painting and trying to take that idea of sheerness and apply it to communication. Sheer communication. Odd intonations pin a veil between us, an errant word a scrim of veil between us. Diaphanous, like the moon's halo, the slight obscures dimensions when words fail between us. We believe in fog, not cloud, a mist that lifts and leaves us lost in the veil between us. A gossamer on switchgrass, ice laced above a moving stream, a sentence stale between us. One wall thins at a time until the tissue-built city blurs, the moment pale between us. Step back and we'll dissolve into filaments, silence echoing on the trail between us. The next poem I'd like to share comes from a different source. If you want to put the slide of the, wrong one, sorry. Let me switch. I'll do this poem. Comes from another piece at the South Dakota Art Museum, Hatched by Beverly Pepper. It's part of the Cockerline collection there at the museum, prints of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And one of the things I was uncomfortable responding to at first with my poetry was abstraction. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to see in it, and I was very aware that I have gaps in my art history knowledge, and I might not always be interpreting the art as someone who knew more about art would or could. But as I grew comfortable, I started to use a lot of that riffing trope, and this is one of those. So this is a tritina. The form of the poem is a tritina, and I actually use the visual images of the hatch and the name of the piece as hatch to generate a lot of images for this poem. And another thing you should know about the tritina is that it's a form. It uses 3 words at the end of the lines in a certain pattern, and then uses all 3 of those words in the last line. Beginning. I've emerged, not from a painted grid of orange and black strokes, distinct lines and angles measured in inches, but hatched from a shell, a bulb, a grain of salt, hatched from that last life. Here's a new grid, a fresh space, the crisscrossed lines that mark my lover's skin. This grid traces the blade's point, crack of a hatched plan. My words press against these lines, the lines of a mind hatched into the brush's grid. And now for a bit different time frame, women defending castle with bow and crossbow. So one of my mentors at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where I took my PhD, is in the history department, Dr. Carol Levin. And she's one of the first people that was inspiring me to write poems for my classes that were not in the English department. So I took a class with her called Saints, Witches, and Mad Women, and I wrote a chapbook of poetry in that class. And then she would keep sending me things over the years. She keeps doing this too. She keeps sending me things. She's write a poem about this, write a poem about this. So she sent me this book of postcards of illuminated manuscripts focused on women, and this is one of the ones that really intrigued me, because here are women on this castle, and they're defending the castle, but there's nothing in their weapons but flowers. And so I wrote a sonnet about this, and using my own interpretation of how wise I thought that was. Not so wise, I guess. That's spoiler alert. Women defending castle with bow and crossbow. Only posies? Without arrows, just flowers. I wonder. One at the barbican stows a posy between her thumb and finger. A crossbow, aimed from the apse, is empty. Midway, a woman steadies a blossom with her hand. Another grasps a bunch by the stems, ready to fling them over the parapet. Even gold petals adorn the red background. Some interpret this as a woman's greatest weapon is love. But once a heart's deployed to battle, one can't call it back to bed. Another thing about that poem is it's one of the tropes of ekphrasis to speak into history and to offer a current interpretation of that history. So I had fun with that, speaking into the history moment there. So these are from my book Untrust, published by the University of New Mexico Press. And so I will share some other ones from my other one. I call these books the twins. because they were published at the same time, and they actually started as the same book. And I sent it out, or the request for manuscripts, and I sent it out, and it came back rejected, but with a very kind rejection that said, there's some great poems in here, but you're just trying to do too much. So I cried, honestly, I cried a little bit. But then I printed all the poems out, and I went into this frenzy of ordering, and what came up was actually what became these two books is separated out. So this book, Blue Word Screening, was published by Terrapin Books in 2016. And I think that's one of the reasons there's so much art in them, is that they used to be in the same book, mostly poems about love. And so when I separated them out, this book became about, half of it's about raising a child with a rare form of epilepsy, and the other part of it is about recurrent miscarriage. So this is where I said I often use form and art to kind of get at some of those emotional, tender topics that I feel that I need some distance from, or a lens from, or a frame for to express. I just need a little bit of that distance, and art helps me do that. So the first one here, if you will, is Boy at Rest. In these poems, you need to know a little bit more about the background of my son's epilepsy syndrome to kind of appreciate them by listening to them. So my son has a rare form of epilepsy called Landau-Kleffner syndrome. And he first had the kinds of seizures when he was 4 years old that most people see, like the tonic-clonic kind, or the seizing, those kinds of seizures, I guess. It's been so long, it's been such a crazy experience. I don't even seem to remember what people think about epilepsy. I'm so immersed in that world. Sometimes I forget what people associate with it. But anyway, when he was 6, he went to a specialist because his language started to be effective and his behavior. He started acting very rigid. He started having a lot of meltdowns and tantrums, and I couldn't quite understand what was happening. I didn't know if it was because of the epilepsy or because of the medication complications. And he also started to lose his ability to understand language and use language, both of those things. And so that's part of Landau-Kleffner, is there are so many seizures happen at night when he sleeps, 1 per minute actually, that you can only see on the EEG, that it disrupts his language processing and his sleep and his ability to even remember things that happened in the day. So if you know those things, this poem will make a lot more sense. And I think when I'm doing readings, I over-explain them a little bit because I know you can't sit here and reread it if you need to do another reading. So this poem is first inspired by the piece of art, Girl at Rest. And so it has an epigraph of Carolyn Forche. While sleeping, the child vanishes from his life. Boy at Rest. In Girl at Rest, I saw only a hazy silhouette of a child's body, the navy blue frame of her arms, head, and a bit of torso. And I read the artist's choice of ochre and light gray, shades shifting only slightly, to convey background and skin with wonder. The colors nearly vanish the child. When I study my son asleep, it's in full dimension. Eyelids threaded with a blue vein, a freckle emerging on the outline of his lip. There's no facial stress, but I don't need to guess. Rest is an illusion, not a feature of a brain besought by seizures. By day, they complicate the spelling of C-A-T, blur the way sounds, rolling into each other, infuse meaning. When sound does get through this screen of spells, a word may fail to find its place on his tongue. The seizures also erase memories of lunchtime pizza, gym class tag, the answer to, "What's your last name?" the need to look both ways before crossing the parking lot outside the store. On the monitor, I hear him speak, a midnight phrase thrown from deep sleep, and I wonder what words emerge despite the seizure's surge from the visual play of his dreams. What world does he vanish to? It seems impossible to draw in ink or words more than a sleeping child's curves and angles. When I tiptoe into his room to retuck his blanket, I'll only assume that wherever he's at, he'll come back. So one of the things that when I saw the image of Girl at Rest and I started to describe it in my notebook, I immediately thought of how many times I would go in and watch Holden sleep. And so the art became a springboard for an invitation of sorts for me to consider my son and talk a little bit more about him. The next poem is, it's The Journey. For some reason, I resist like when people say, "Oh, that's a tough journey." It's a euphemism. So I kind of poke fun at that in this poem, this idea that we're on this journey, because being the mother of a child with special needs and health conditions doesn't feel like a journey. Sometimes it feels like a chaos or a nightmare, or sometimes it's really amazing, but it definitely doesn't feel like a journey. I don't know when it won't end. Journeys seem to have ends, and so. But I wrote that this is a piece, so the title came from the piece of art, Diana Bale's Sojourner. And what I did here is I was really thinking hard about what process Diana Bale used to create this print. And it seemed like, I guess I could ask her, because she's one of my colleagues at SDSU, but I didn't ask her. I tried to extrapolate what process she used to create this piece. And I was really looking at, it looked like there were bits of paper that were cut up. And so I thought, what if I wrote a poem that cut up words and then I put them back together, and I kind of played around with this idea of cutting up words. And I thought it was appropriate in this book about my son's seizures, because that's a lot what happens to him. Like he would make up words and make up phrases when he couldn't think of the actual ones. For example, for a long time he called vending machines snack booths. And it became quite usual. We all started calling them snack booths. And I actually knew that his seizures were getting better when he stopped using that phrase and started to use the correct term. So I thought playing around with a language would be really an interesting way to tackle this. And so in this poem, this is also a troitina. I use a lot of forms. I play with a lot of traditional forms. So this is also a troitina, and it's a little bit abstract, a bit like the art. It's the journey. I'm tempted to clip lines, snip apart a surface of syntax, toss up a strip of sky surfing letters, puzzle word petals into corollas. In Bale's print, her petals of pink paper were never whole. My strip of words turning in air will part ways too, transformed. Each sashimi strip and hair ribbon, all gladiola petals and beetle wings, will become part of a new part. Glad wings, hair strip, bug petals. And the next one. So this is one of my favorite pieces because of the story, because of the relationship that emerged from me responding to this piece. So this is Art of the Body. It's a print by Pauline Aitken, and she did this piece in 1969. And when I first sat down with this piece in the museum and I started to look at it, I really thought, well, first of all, I saw a woman jumping out of it in the pink part, over there. And then I saw all of these membranes. And then I really started to see, wow, this is very biological. It looks like cells. It looks like this. And so I started to associate things. And I also started to do some research on membranes and look at the idea of membranes, especially in epilepsy. So my process for this was like, just describe it, then I associated, and then I took some of the concepts I associated with it, and I started to do some research on it, especially, membranes and cells, and membranes and epilepsy, and membranes and neurons in the brain, and all sorts of things. And those poems, I drafted a few poems, and I really didn't like them. I didn't feel like they were working. So almost towards the end of my fellowship, I stumbled across this. I was back at the museum. I had my son with me, and he was running around the museum, so I was trying to hurry up and leave because I thought he was distracting some people there. But we came to look at some of the art, and I was getting ready to leave, and I realized like all of the pieces I had been writing about had a lot to do with the body. And so I said, oh, this is really what it's about. This piece is called Aquaform, and my poem is called Art of the Body. So the form of this poem is called, I guess, a mirror or reversal. I'm not sure the exact title for it, the exact name of it. But I do a few things here. Like I mentioned, it's in the context of the museum, that inspiration of looking at the piece in the museum and my son darting around. But then it's also about the epilepsy syndrome. And in the form, I reverse the poem. So you'll hear the poem reverse at midway. And then I'll tell you about the relationship. Art of the body. I see art in the body and the body in art, no matter where I look on this wall, in canvases, in my son's darting shadow. Aquaform, with its nucleus at the heart, membranes and organelles I'll call these shapes, and I'll make this a window to consider seizures, how they part neurons and words, how they stall my son's learning. Mine feels shallow. On a gallery walk, thoughts start. I focus first, then fall into paint, into cells, into sorrow. Into paint, into cells, into sorrow, I focus first, then fall. On a gallery walk, my thoughts start, my son's learning. Mine feels shallow. Neurons and words, how they stall to consider seizures, how they part these images and make this a window. Membranes and organelles I'll call aquaform, with its nucleus at the heart. In canvases, in my son's darting shadow, no matter where I look on this wall, I see art in the body, and the body in art. So, as part of the project for this exhibit, this ekphrasis exhibit that I did at the museum, so the fellowship was in 2012, and then in 2016 we had the exhibit. They sent the catalogs to all the painters and artists that they could find whose work I responded to. And Pauline Aitken lives in the UK, and she really liked my poem, and she found it really intriguing that I was responding to her work. So she ordered Blue Word screening, and she started to respond to my book and painting. And so I guess 2 summers ago, before the pandemic began, Pauline traveled actually to Colorado, to Denver, where her son lives, and I met her there, and we spent 2 days working together, talking about our collaboration and trying to see where it would go. So we have an exhibition planned for our work. And she showed me a lot of the pieces that she was starting to develop from my work. So the poem I'm going to read to you now, this piece is actually in process. It's not a finished piece, and it's not a very good representation. So Pauline, if you're listening, I'm sorry. But this is one of the pieces that Pauline did in response to my poem that I'm going to read to you, which is called 13 Ways of Understanding Blue Word. So this poem always makes me laugh a little bit because it's pretty cliche for poets to respond to Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. I mean, it's super cliche. Like, every poet does it, I think. And I always said I wasn't going to, because I'm not a huge fan of Wallace Stevens. But I found that this would be a really good way to kind of get to the more abstract qualities of what I wanted to express about my son losing language. You know, my friends all marvel that the son of a poet loses language. Like, the son of a professor can't learn for a long time. Like, he went on a learning hiatus for several years. So what does that look like? And I tried to give that words, what that felt like and what that experience was like. So 13 ways of understanding Blue Word. And Blue Word is a term I made up. I made it up, and it means any given word spoken by someone with aphasia. So, 1. Among 1 million combinations, the only uttered thing was a syllable of a blue word. 2. The boy is eternally present, like a mouth, speaking blue word, blue word, blue word. 3. The blue word disappeared on the cusp of a dream. It was one memory lost in a seizing brain. 4. A boy and a thought sync up. A boy and a thought and a blue word sync up. 5. I do not know which to prefer. My nerves are gone, or Nerf gun, Nerf gun? I want a Nerf gun. The blue word appearing, or just leaving. 6. Brainwaves filled the paper with abnormal data, the outline of blue words scribbled up and down. A symptom translated when he writes, hand revealing all. 7. Oh, grown-ups in my life, why do you imagine me a comedian? Do you not hear the blue words shift as you sleep? You're adults. Adults are chameleons. 8. Blue, 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 blue world, blue wood, blue bird, word, blue, word, blue word. 9. When a blue word softened into a pool of silence, it smudged the edge of understanding. 10. At the sound of a string of blue words arriving in syntactical precision, even the speech pathologist would applaud loudly. 11. He listens for his past before a computer screen. Once longing piqued him in that he remembered a time without a blue word. 12. Summer rain shakes the linden tree's leaves. The blue word must be fluttering. 13. It was midnight all morning. Seizures were spiking and they were going to spike. The blue word lodged in the back of his throat. So I'm hopefully, Pauline and I did make a video of our collaboration work, and hopefully we'll be done with that soon, and so we'll post that on my website. So if you're interested in that collaboration, you come look at that some more there. And then I have three more poems for you tonight. They're from my collection that's coming out in June called The Poet and the Architect, where I started to work on a lot of ekphrasis, like I mentioned earlier, response to architecture. And one of the reasons I wanted to read this, I have two more guzzles for you. I actually don't write a lot of guzzles, but apparently they all are ekphrastic based, and they all ended up in the reading tonight. So that might be good, so you'll get some experience with that form if it's new to you. But one of the things I wanted to show you here in this image is that the piece of art, the abandoned Wisconsin cheese factory, when I saw that piece, what I saw was the abandonment and this ruins, this idea of ruins. And so I actually connected that with the Mills Ruins Park, and actually that's the place where my husband and I got married, was that park down there, and there's all these ruins down there. And one of the reasons we thought it was a perfect place to elope to, we decided like the day before that's where we were going to get married, was because there was this really beautiful transformation of history and ruins and nature, because there's St. Anthony's Falls goes right through there. There's this beautiful bridge there, and it's in the middle of a city. We just thought it was a really great intersection of different kinds of spaces, and it reflected our relationship too. So, so I just wanted to juxtapose those two images for you here, so you can start to get the connections a little bit more. And this is called Palimpsest. We lean on the bridge's bones, spine of rest, ruins of iron, a picture of life against ruins. Abandoned means maples, oaks, and cedars are free to touch your forehead and say, new love, trust ruins. An arch of stone and an arch of I do span walls, St. Anthony Falls, 2 lives, and a park's ruins. Abandoned is the heel's impression as the foot steps away, a mark smoothed when we discussed ruins. Before we met, you called out to me. When the words arrived in my ear, I thought that they were just ruins. At the shell of a river mill, ghost flour falls through the air. Flakes of factory snow, dust ruins. My love, the landscape subsumed my past and yours and left a trace upon which our vows trust ruins. Summer of Smoke is less of an ekphrastic piece, although I do have an image with this. This is my husband's scan piece he did from downtown Brookings. It's kind of fictional. I mean, it's a scan of the real town, but he moved some things around in the scan, and I love this piece because it reminds me of last summer and the summer of the pandemic and what we were experiencing, the difficulties we were experiencing adjusting to the pandemic, but it also gave me a way to talk about the current cultural things that are happening too. So we had our Black Lives Matter march here in downtown Brookings along this route that you see here, and I referenced that in the poem. And this is also a ghazal. Summer of Smoke. We fought over fire as flames fed the smoke. Later you kissed me and your lips shed the smoke. Protests turn and cities burn. A dream deferred explodes. Smothering justice will spread the smoke. I savored roasted marshmallows and blistered hot dogs. What I recall first instead, the smoke. Tendril of milk and coffee steams so thick it scarfs my mouth. In everything we read the smoke. Flame transforms blueprints and stories. My body's a fire vessel. A phoenix threads the smoke. When fever architects my dreams, the song leaves my city, music drops, and words wed the smoke. Christine, you know ghost scents. Bacon and bourbon, rose and cigarettes. It's why you dread the smoke. One rule of the ghazal I broke in the other ones, where you're supposed to reference yourself the second to the last line. I kept that rule this time, but sometimes I break it because it's really hard to reference yourself in multiple poems. So the last poem in this part of the presentation, before we go on to questions and answers, is called Anatomy. This is my home in Brookings, and this is my husband's scan of our home in Brookings. He got a laser scanner, and he spent 3 or 4 days learning to use it, and he had thousands of images of our house. And he didn't let me clean it, because sometimes you can see inside, like he just like, this is gonna be it. I'm gonna do the house like it is. And I was like, okay. So I was astounded to see the beauty of these scans. I was astounded to see, they look like paintings, but like photographs. Some of them look like architectural designs. This one's pretty straightforward, but a lot of them look really different, because you can slice through, with a laser scanner, you can slice through different parts of the house, and you can, or the space, and you can, he does all these crazy things with turning the house and making it into a model, and it's really pretty intense. So the poem I wrote from it is based on the image, but also based on the process by which he created these scans. Oh, and this is a quadrille with some changes that I made. So you'll expect some refrains and some rhyming here. Anatomy. We need a new home with good bones, he said. That first winter, he scanned every surface with a laser. Now a surgeon with a keyboard and mouse, he dissects the model. We've got a home with good bones, and I see them as he slices one way, hallways, musculature, and stairs, arteries. 2 more clicks reveal organs, couch, chair, bed. Our 100-year home with good bones looks like a doll's house with its front sheared off, but its dolls aren't home, no pixelated ghosts either, just sheer pools of color, toy, blanket. We're lungs in a home with good bones, and outside the umbrella spines of old trees hover as we breathe. So I hope that you saw lots of different ways that poets can respond to art. There can be talking into history, you can tell stories, you can use the frame of the art for inspiration to talk about your own concerns or emotional realities. You can riff off them and not really even represent the image in your poems. There's so many ways that art opens up possibilities for generating and then for speaking to and into the creating conversations and relationships with other artists and with history and with other writers. So it's been a very rich and meaningful writing practice for me. So I'm happy to answer questions that you have about my poems. I can read more poems if you like, or I can talk a little bit about my research.
All right, well, thank you for actually bringing up some of those tropes. We do have one question about one of them. So CJ writes, I really like the way you spoke about ekphrasis as speaking into history.
And your experience of writing poem as history in a history course / conversations program. Maybe also that visual art speaks into poetry, right? Do you experience ekphrasis as a way to be multilingual or a kind of exit from poetry? Something about your way of talking about it makes it sound like the poems happen in a kind of exit from rigidly defined boundaries between arts and discourses.
So one of the things we were talking about a lot with like the relationships and what was happening with Pauline and I were talking about it in our discussion of what was happening between us, like when she would look at my poems, read my poems, and I would look at her art. And actually it started, the first iteration of that conversation happened when I was looking at the art from the Cockerline collection in the South Dakota Art Museum, because I was talking with Neil Cockerline is the person who like curated this collection and then donated it to the museum. And so I was interviewing him about it, and I asked him, I said, so what is it happens when an artist responds to a poem? Like, what's that called? What's the reverse ekphrasis? And he said, maybe it's illustration. And we're like, yeah, that's illustration. It's illustration, but it doesn't feel like the right term, right? So Pauline and I were talking about that too. And we're like, well, what's really happening there is a response, right? But she said it's a particular kind of response. It's a translation. It's a translation of the subject matter into one's own medium. So I don't know if I would call it necessarily an exit, but just like a way of a new pathway to understanding and to bringing that back in. So what's interesting to me now about ekphrasis and what it's become for me is this kind of a collaboration with other artists, and now it can go back and forth. So it's not just one way. And that's how I experienced ekphrasis for the longest time, until Pauline said, wait a second, like, let's make this something. Let's exchange work. Let's see what happens. And then I looking what I'm doing, and then we have this conversation between us in different mediums. And it is, in fact, and it does shape the way that I write poetry, I think, because when I knew that some of those poems were going to be up on a wall, I was thinking about squares and rectangles and forms that were small and shaped that way. And I know that sounds, that might sound strange to people, but I never thought of poems that way. I never cared what they looked like on the page. It was just the poem. But now, and especially after learning so much about architecture and design from my husband, I'm really thinking a lot about not just like the squares and rectangles, like how it would look on a wall next to the art, but the way the poem's embodied on the page and the structures that are involved in it, and the way the lines look and the way the poem unfolds visually too. So I think that I'm learning a different language, I think, or a different way of thinking about poems that I hadn't before, a more artistic way than I had before. So I don't know if that gets to your question about history so much, but it kind of, I was responding to more of the part of your comment about where this takes me as a writer.
That's wonderful.
Christine. We've got a few more questions. So Hamish asks, what would you say is the hardest part of writing poetry that focuses on ekphrasis in particular?
Definitely being aware of like the whole history of art. I was so uncomfortable, like, even at the beginning, writing the first poem, because I just didn't go to art museums when I was a kid, and I didn't take art classes. So I felt like and I still have this huge, like, Grand Canyon-sized gap of knowledge. So I think what's hardest is to just trust that as a viewer, I still have some interpretation skills and that can make or inform a good poem, because that's my area of expertise, is the writing of the poems and the language there. And even if a piece just inspires a little bit of that, that's okay. But one of the things I'm learning is that this has opened up an inquiry for me too about the process of art, how art is created. And so now I have some poems based on the processes of art, like I said, with the It's a Journey piece, and I have a couple of other pieces in Blueword screening that really reflect like the processes of creating art. And that's opened up a whole new way of thinking. So in this one poem I have, it compares, well, it's kind of hard to explain. It's probably the most, I don't know, the most erudite poem I have in this book, but it tries to take the process of printmaking. So what I understood about printmaking is that you make the print and you roll over it, and then you put a different piece of paper on and you roll over it again, and every time it's the same print, but there could be deletions of the paint. The paint can look different, and that's what makes it unique. That's what makes each one unique. And I was comparing that to the miscarriages I had, actually. I was comparing that to the chromosomal abnormalities that the doctor said probably caused the miscarriages. So like when there's deletions, right? And so what I did, I said, what is the poetry analog to that printmaking process in context of the miscarriages? What I did is I took 6 lines of a poem and I anagrammed them, and then I deleted one word and I anagrammed it again, and I deleted I needed a letter and I anagrammed it again and I deleted another letter. So it's called Variables Intrinsic to Printmaking to Procreation. And I like artist proof, premium print, my son, my AP, impressions after him, flawed, just as iterations with each night's press. So that was the main poem, and then I kind of see it, I did the anagrams and the deletions of that poem to get the rest of the lines. And so the lines read kind of like nonce. You know, but I also chose the best anagrams to kind of reflect the emotional tenor too. So, yeah. So the hardest part, I think, is recognizing that there's a huge gap in my knowledge and letting myself be okay with that, and trying to learn as I go, and then trusting that experts will help me out here and there when I need some background or some insight. That will help deepen my work and my response to the art, because then the more I know, the more possibilities are available to me for the interpretation and the writing of the poems that emerge.
Well, this was a fun question. Are you ready? Okay. It's about your favorites. Okay. So it's kind of a two-part. So it's Max prefaces saying simple question. I don't think it's simple, but I hope it's fun. Who are some of your favorite poets that you draw inspiration from, and then your favorite visual artists that inspire your work? So poets and visual art. I know. I told you it wasn't easy, but it'll be hopefully fun.
What frustrates me about this great question, because it's a great question, is that I often get this question and I never have the same answer. And you'd think that I would have a standard answer, because I get this question all the time, but no, every time it sends me into a little bit of a panic. So when I look back, like in graduate school, I started to look at what poets that I'm most like traditionally, like what's my lineage? And so I'd say that it's more along the Walt Whitman lines rather than the Emily Dickinson lines, and more William Carlos Williams more than Wallace Stevens. And it's more Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton and maybe some Gwendolyn Brooks, and as opposed to other kinds of other writers that were writing at the time. And it's more In contemporary, I guess, then there's a lot of poets of the 60s and 70s that were influencing me, feminist poets that were influencing me. June Jordan, Audre Lorde, Maxine Kumin, oh my gosh, see, that's what happens, like just my brain just went off. Feminist poet.
There's only one of those, so.
Adrienne Rich, sorry, I just had to think about it. I had to think about it a minute. I was like, she wrote that book with Audre Lorde, and then they had this big, yeah, anyway, sorry. Just looking at you helps me though, Catherine, just looking at you, I just remembered it. So, I mean, I think that for the longest time, and so it's interesting because I've been writing poetry since I was a kid. My sister died when I was 11 years old, and I started writing poems and stuffing them into her coffin as a way of like just coping with this sudden tragedy in my family. And I just kept writing, and I became one of those like weird girls who write. You know, I mean, I'm still wearing the black, right? So I grew this identity of being that person who wrote. And when I got to college, as an undergrad at the University of Northern Iowa, I took some creative writing classes, but I didn't want to write in form. And there was this amazing, brilliant poet, Annie Finch, who was teaching there at the time. And I was like, I don't want to take her class because she teaches form. And then, of course, like my biggest regret, right? Because now I write in form, and I actually discovered form by reading her book, A Formal Feeling Comes, Contemporary Poems by Women in Form. And so then what I realized is that so there are all of these feminist poets that I started to read that were writing in free verse and like these really open, rhythmic, rich writing. But they're also women that were writing with traditional forms, and that you could actually break these traditional forms. You can like merge it. You can create the forms your own way. You can update them. And so then I started to really experiment with those sorts of poets and poetry. So I think I can't say there's one poet I go to right now for like inspiration. I try to read very widely with poetry, but I have my own kind of style that I focus on. So I will read just to keep up with what everyone else is doing and to support other poets and to learn from them indirectly. But I don't really have someone I go to in that way for inspiration. I usually look to research and experience for the inspiration. If I need to look at all, typically things pop up, tensions I see, things I want to respond to pop up in my life, and that's where I start to write. So artists, oh my, I have all these architects in my head because they're all in the book, but like Louis Sullivan and Frank Gehry and Frank Lloyd Wright, you know, even ones my husband doesn't like. So they still got into the book. His least favorite architect still got in there somehow. So it's really hard for me to remember the good ones. I try not, or the ones that are fresh in my mind. One of the things I try to remember is that the artist doesn't have to be famous or a canonical artist for me to want to respond to them. Like, I think sometimes I find photographs or I find obscure pieces that still speak to me or still draw some tension that I want to respond to. And so for me, it's pretty wide ranging. Like when I stumbled upon the W Fashion magazine, I was taking a class in grad school called the Psychosociological Aspects of Clothing. And it was for my Women's and Gender Studies certificate, and we could do that as graduate students as long as we took those classes outside our major area. So I tried to take professors who will let me write poetry for those classes. And so I was at Barnes & Noble, and I heard my classmates talking about like W Fashion magazine, and so I was like, what is this fashion magazine? And I opened it up, and there's this portfolio of artists responding to Kate Moss. It was like Lucian Freud and a lot of really famous artists in different ways, like painting and graphic design and photography. And she had been a supermodel when I was a teenager, so I thought this was a really interesting connection. Like I could try to look at the narratives that others were imposing upon her iconic status, and I could respond to them. So I never would have said that any of those artists were inspirational to me, but the context that they were working within was inspirational to me.
That's really great insight, because I think sometimes we feel like we need to look at famous pieces instead of just something that resonates with us and just sitting with that resonation. So thank you. That was really insightful. Our next question is another one from Hamish. He asks how you choose the structures of your poem, like during your writing process. How do you make that decision?
Oh, that's a great question. So I'm a big believer in kind of grappling with the content and the imagery before a form emerges. And so I usually try to, like with the ekphrastic, I try to just visually describe what I'm seeing, or if it's not art, I just imagine or try to get in the sensory world, because I think poetry works best through sensory language. It's the most persuasive kind of appeal for literary texts. So I usually pick those images and kind of get a sense of what I want the poem to say or where I want the poem to go. And then I kind of look and I say, well, does this seem to be a form? It just seems to have something to say about a form. There's a poem in my new book, The Poet and the Architect, that used to be a sestina. And one of the things, sestina has 39 lines and 6 words that repeat in 6 ways at the end of each line. It's like there's a pretty strict pattern. And I had wanted to write a poem about the thinking process of an architect. I wanted to understand the parallels between my process and my husband's design process. And so I thought a sestina would be a good way to tackle that. I had a bunch of images written down, and it seemed to circle back and forth, like the same words were coming up again and again. So I was like, oh, those could be the last words of the lines, because then I have to use them again and they'll repeat. But as per usual with sestinas, like they're really hard. Like you get 4 good stanzas and then you kind of run out of steam. I cobbled it together, but I was never quite happy with that. But it generated a lot of new ideas. So like trying to complete the form actually was generative for me, and it helped me complete it. And then the poem fell out of the form, right? Because it wasn't working. So I just tossed the form and just made changes as I wanted to, and it actually became a poem in 4 different parts with some of those words repeating. So you can kind of sense that it maybe used to be a form, but no, it's a form no longer. So I get a sense for, is there something that repeats? Is there something, a refrainness about it? Because there are lots of forms that use refrains. Sometimes if it's an argument, or if it's about love or relationships, I'm like, should this be a sonnet? I don't know, maybe, So a lot of the forms that have arguments or themes embedded in them, I'll consider them, but they don't always necessarily dump into that form. I found myself writing a lot in form in this new book, and actually I'm making up a lot of forms because the structural element of architecture really demanded me to think more structurally about my poems and what I was doing structurally in every poem. So I did more experimenting with forms and structures in that book than I think I have in even these other books. But a form is a tool. Sometimes it's a tool to generate poems. Sometimes it's a tool to revise poems. Sometimes it can function in a lot of different ways for me as a writer.
Okay, well, it looks like we're caught up actually on questions. I'll put out a call to all of you. So if there are lingering questions, or for the folks that are here, if there are questions, we'll go for another poem maybe.
Sure.
We'll have a poem, and then do last call for questions. That seemed like a good idea. So if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. We're chatting with Dr. Christine Stewart-Nuñez, Poet Laureate of South Dakota, and she's offering some really insightful reflections on her process, on her past poems, on her new book coming up, The Poet and the Architect. I provided the link to her website earlier in the chat, but I'll go drop it one more time. There you can find links to her previous publications as well as more information about our speakers. So hopefully that is useful and interesting.
No, I'm just going to read the top poem because they're not in any particular order. It's just like literally it's the manuscript proof. So I was doing that in the Heller Center, actually. I was proofing the manuscript. So this is Love and Fear in a Pandemic. And I wasn't going to write about the pandemic at all. I kept writing when the pandemic started, but I was only finishing projects or continuing on those that I'd already started because it takes me a long time to process things. And I was just trying to keep my kids safe, really. My older son, obviously, that I've talked a lot about, he's high risk. If he would get sick, he could go into some sort of seizure stuff. We just don't know, right? Because it's a new virus and his brain is already compromised. And then I also ended up having another son who's 5, and I wanted to keep him safe too. So I wasn't going to write, but then my friend Charity asked this group to respond to the pandemic in writing, and I thought I would play along. It's on a Facebook group. I'll play along, and a series of poems emerged, and the third one was actually published in the New York Times on Thanksgiving. They asked the Poets Laureate of the state to write a Thanksgiving poem, and to be frank, I couldn't imagine writing a Thanksgiving poem when the pandemic was raging in South Dakota, and I was just angry and scared and worried. So I submitted something kind of different, and they still put it there. So it's the third stanza of a three-part poem. Love and Fear in a Pandemic. 1. Once, when pregnant with death, heart stopped within my womb. I realized I loved someone I'd never meet. I draw on that vibration as April deepens in this rural place, folks still lifting their laughter to the sky in large, loquacious groups. Last night my husband said if he takes sick and succumbs, he'll die thinking of me, and I realized the power of loving through time. Elsewhere, bodies pile up, hospitals overwhelmed, and survivors grieve. Despite the ache and anchor of these 4 walls, during the quarantine, I recall love, and for now, I stay in. 2. If not in quarantine, I wouldn't think twice about biking through a graveyard and pausing at the Gerber daisies strewn across loose soil, and I wouldn't wonder if the 90-year-old died alone, nursing home locked down, or surrounded by family. If not in quarantine, I wouldn't raise an eyebrow when my 4-year-old asks if we can bike through again to see if a body's in an open pit. And I wouldn't drop everything to find a kid-friendly video on burials, only to have him throw his arms around me when it's done. I hope you don't get the virus, Mommy. If not in quarantine, my child wouldn't worry this way. 3. The pandemic puts pressure on love and presents fear with a new playground. Love's learning to teach our sons art, math, reading. It's cooking 3 meals a day and remote working under the microscope of one another's gaze. Unmoored, we click on graphs, charts, photos. Testimonies of the sick, the dead, and their survivors shape our story and story our fears. Metaphor falters when we scrutinize the data, and we can't find beauty there. Love's reaching for each other only to find our scars relaxed. In these walls, we have food, resources, each other. Love and fear's first real test. We're really working hard not to make the language beautiful in that poem. I really, one of the things I realized is that I didn't I wanted to stay away from the sound I usually use in a poem and the figurative language, because I felt it just wasn't appropriate for me yet in this to write about something like that. So, I mean, maybe someday it will be, it'll feel different, but it was a different kind of poem for me to write. It was a different kind of process. So that's one of the new ones.
Thank
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember seeing that come across the New York Times. And it was super interesting to see like the takes of all of the different poets laureate from around the country, and yeah, what a time to be alive, what a time to be writing.
I also do want to mention that I admire the other poets laureate because they like wrote, their deadline was like 4 days. Like they gave us 4 days and I was like, I can't write something in 4 days. It's got to be something I have, you know. I mean, I'll send it and see what they say, but I was really admiring the others because.
They all have families? Do they have? Just
Right, I mean, that's right, you know, I mean, I don't know if there was something percolating or what, but, yeah.
That would be a lot.
Right. I mean, part of this pandemic has been scheduling with
Right,
all the things, moving parts at home.
yeah,
And I love that your poetry is so. A lot of poetry is intimate. I mean, it has to come from you, but the sharing aspect of this, it's so strong, and I just really appreciate you sharing that, and you like, how does that work in your process? Like you make a decision about how exposed.
yeah, that's a great question. When I was writing a lot of the miscarriage poems, so I had Holden, and I had four miscarriages after that, and then his father and I got a divorce, and I remarried. So that's where, then ta-da! I ended up having another one. So I hadn't intended to share those poems. So I never censor myself in terms of what I'm writing, but I always then say, well, do I want to send this out or share it? So I was at a conference at SDSU. It was a very small, I knew a lot of the people in the room, and it was on feminism and in the body or something. And I said, well, I'll share some poems. And I shared some of those poems because I felt like it was a safe place, and I was just going to see the reaction, like maybe people would walk out. But this woman came up after me, and she was in her 60s, and she's just like, that happened to me, and I never told anyone, and I've never shared those stories, but now I have a language, for that. And then I thought, well, it's pretty self-serving if I'm worried about being embarrassed or worried about, that vulnerability. If one other person besides her can get that from the poems, then I'll share them. And so when I put Blue Was Greening together, and a lot of the poems take on the miscarriages directly, but most of them are pretty indirect, and about just like trying to conceive and from oblique perspective, just tell it slant, right? It's not take it straight on. But I was really worried that I wouldn't be able to find a publishing home for it because it was so intense, so intense. But after I separated the books out and it got chosen for publication within like a couple of months. It was unbelievable. That's pretty quick for me. That's pretty quick. So I was like, oh well, I guess it has some cultural resonance.
Definitely.
So. Well, we got a comment and then a question in the chat here, and then Reagan, I heard that you might have a question.
Oh, yeah, it is in the chat.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so we're good. I've got it all together. All right. So the first was a comment from CJ, and he just wanted to express that it was a great talk and reading. Thanks for the super smart discussion afterwards. Also, the poem in the coffin. I've done that. Totally quoted Wallace Stevens in mine, and unhappy people in a happy world. so similar experience there. And then Hamish's question, or Reagan, I don't know, some kind of sort of collaboration going on over there. How often do you go into a piece with an idea, but the end ends up being totally different, and what has this taught you?
Almost always that happens. So there's an adage in writing, and I can't remember now who said it because everybody says it, but if there's no surprise for the writer, there won't be a surprise for the reader. And I basically kind of take that to mean if I'm not discovering something new or pushing myself somehow, then I won't be able to take that experience to a reader either. So I often use writing as discovery and inquiry and research. I really love it that this is about the humanities and research and creativity together, because I really feel that what I do is research. It just looks very different than my colleagues in other parts of the university. So it's inquiry. I look at the material, I look at experience, I look at sources, and then I draw on that to make discoveries or make statements or make arguments or try to give some emotional impressions of the gestalt of that. And so sometimes that takes a long time to happen. It happens over 40 drafts, right? Lots of drafts, or lots of years even. One of the things that I did, sometimes I do, is I just kind of look at drafts that never made it anywhere, and I pick my favorite lines, and I see if I can, collage them into a poem and see what happens. It's just kind of a exercise, but sometimes that leads to some new discovery or a new place, and the intention totally shifts. I think I'm writing about this, and then there's traction with a metaphor, there's traction with some research or another idea, and I abandon it. It was kind of like what happened in the Art of the Body poem, when I originally thought it was going to be all about membranes and cellular work, but membranes just became one tiny part of the end poem. So I think that happens a lot. I think it's taught me that I'm always learning, and I love being a writer for that, because I can, whatever I'm interested in or whatever's catching my attention, I can start to pursue that and then have it inform my work. So I try to open up that process and be open to changing and be open to what the practice introduces me to. That was a good question.
Well, thank you so much for being here, for sharing your work and your thoughts. Thank you to everybody who joined us on Zoom. And if you are watching this later, hopefully this has been an illumination for you on one poet's experience. So, Annette, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I guess as we wind up, I've got some closing things to say. I want to thank everyone for coming this evening. This is my last Heller Fellowship as the faculty director, and I just really enjoyed being here, and I feel like you've really, not only did you give a wonderful presentation of your poetry, but you really embodied what Heller can do in terms of I think Rhonda recently put it as reaching out of our academic corners. Yes. And collaborating, and this was just a perfect example of that. So I want to say thank you for making my last one a wonderful one. Thank you for sharing your work and yourself with us, and not just tonight, but all week, engaging with our students and all of it. And thank you, Catherine, for asking, for making this happen. We want to thank our wonderful tech folks who made this whole streaming live thing possible, and all the various campus entities who support our programming here at Heller. It takes a lot of labor, often invisible labor, to maintain this venue and make these events go smoothly, and we appreciate all the UCCS staff who make it all work. Last but not least, I would like to thank those who made tonight possible through their philanthropy. The late Chandler and Melita Bergen established an endowment to support arts and humanities initiatives at the Heller Center, and we are grateful for their forward thinking and generosity that allows for learning and exploration through programs like the one tonight. So we really are appreciative of that. So thank you everybody for joining us and for submitting questions, and we hope to see you at the next Heller event. Thank you.